Welcome back to Project PhDcast. I am your podcast creator and podcast researcher and host, Alison Innes. And this podcast is a sort of audio journal, audio diary of my PhD research, the kinds of things I'm thinking about and experimenting with. So thank you for joining me today. In today's episode, I want to share 3 articles that I've read this summer, 3 different things I've read this summer that have fit together in a really interesting way for me. And these 3 pieces all relate to the ideas of authenticity and the sonic experience. And they're challenging me to think about my own developing approaches to recording and storytelling with sound, as well as my own research into podcasting relationships. And I'll just give you a little highlight of those 3 articles, links in the show notes as always. The first is the chapter Speaking Sonically from a book by Jeremy Wade Morris called Simply Podcasting, published in 2024 by Polity Press. Then we will look at a recent article published September 3rd, 2025 on 404 Media from Jason Kobler about AI-generated history podcasts. And if you can stick with me through that, I try not to get too depressing here. If you can stick with me through the AI-generated podcast article, we will end up with a blog post about punk rock podcasting by Benjamin Lorch, who's director of Berlin School of Podcasting. That was published earlier this summer on the Hindenburg blog, but I did not read until last week. Cue music. First, a confession. One thing I have struggled to overcome as an independent podcaster has been my worry that my sound quality isn't good enough. I don't have formal training, and like many other indie podcasters, I learn as I go along. And I realize I've also been really intimidated by the kinds of podcasts I listen to on a daily basis. Highly polished shows like Today Explained, The Daily, Politics Weekly, shows that have professional full-time staff and a team of journalists and lawyers and funding beyond what I can dream of. These highly polished shows intimidate me as a creator who squeezes podcasting in between full-time work, part-time PhD studies, and things like walks in nature or doing the dishes or having a nap, things that keep me human. As a result, early on, probably around episode 3 of Myth Take, if I'm perfectly honest, I made a conscious decision not to chase perfect studio quality sound. Rather, I would be a podcaster who embraces contextual and atmospheric sound. Whether it's echoey recording done in a busy hallway, done that, or outside on a sunny day, I've done that too. This approach has become much more fun and much easier this summer when I acquired my own Zoom H6 Essential handheld recorder. And no, this is not a paid ad or sponsorship, although if you work for Zoom, reach out. I've been having a lot of fun playing with this device, experimenting to see what kinds of sounds I can pick up with it. A lot. And in the process, thinking about contextual sounds and how the recording of a place sounds different from my personal experience of a space, which we will get into in some future episode. So in my summer reading, when I got to the chapter on sonic aesthetics in Jeremy Wade Morris's book, Podcasting, the timing for me was perfect. In this chapter, Morris explores how podcasts borrow from other media and formats to create a distinct sonic aesthetic that we can identify as a podcast. Sounds like a podcast. He identifies 4 layers to this aesthetic: formal, format, socio-technical, and social-political. And I'm going to go through these one at a time, quoting from them and giving you some page numbers if you want to delve into these ideas yourself. So first up is this layer of analysis of formal aesthetic. And this considers the decisions about form, the podcasting conventions and the styles of podcasting that we listeners might take for granted. We can see some carryover here from radio, such as the so-called NPR voice, commonly found in podcasts. And if you're not sure what I mean by the NPR voice, listen to a couple of NPR podcasts, and then you will realize you hear that intonation and that way of speaking in a lot of places, at least for American podcasts. It's the kind of voice, you know it when you hear it. It's authoritative yet authentic. It's a voice you can trust. And at this layer of formal aesthetic, we also see the editing decisions to leave things in or perhaps even deliberately perform tangents and stumbles and gaps and spaces. Analysis of the sonic landscape also fits in here. Decisions about how to use music, sound effect, field recordings in ways that can generate curiosity and call back to earlier episodes. Analysis at this formal aesthetic, Morris says, can even get into the nitty-gritty of the voice, including things like accent, dialect, intonation, frequency, as well as your decisions around scripting, mixing, interview techniques, and other choices that, he says, quote, provide listeners with a sense of recognition and familiarity, and that, quote, lay the groundwork for why audiences find trust, connection, and authenticity in the podcast. Page 117 if you're following along in the book. So that's the first layer, the formal aesthetic. The second layer of aesthetics Morris identifies is that of format. Format analysis encompasses the genres and media that predate podcasting. The obvious one here, of course, is radio. Podcasting studies grew out of radio and communication studies. Radio companies like the BBC, CBC, for example, early adopters of using the podcast as a mode of communication, complementary to their radio shows. Podcasting similarities to and differences from radio are still being explored in the scholarly literature and probably will be for quite some time. Like radio, podcasts offer us a sense of vicariousness. They give us, as listeners, the feeling that we're eavesdropping on a conversation, which is, to be honest, the aesthetic I go for with a lot of my podcasting. I want that friendly, informal kind of conversation where you're at one coffee table and I'm at another one and you're listening to me talk to myself or with somebody else. Podcasting's aesthetic also draws on things like blogging and web publishing. So if you were around in the 90s and the 2000s and engaging in those kinds of things, there's a certain familiarity with podcasting there. There's the sequential aspect especially, right? That you revisit, you update periodically. And then podcast creators also bring in aesthetic influences from other genres and interests they have. So they might bring in things from theater, novel, film, even sound art. And Morris goes into these in page 119. He gives here as an example the self-reflexive meta-narrative that is a really distinctive feature of the podcast Serial and subsequent true crime podcasts. If you haven't listened to Serial, give the first season a listen, if only because it was a very influential podcast in terms of bringing greater awareness to podcasts and making them a bit more, just giving the public a sense of what a podcast is, right? Definitely not the first podcast, but an influential one. So worth listening to, if only for that reason. And definitely, once you've listened to Serial and you listen to other true crime podcasts, you will notice a lot of similarities if you are a true crime podcast listener. But Morris notes that while Serial's aesthetics map onto some podcasts, they don't map onto others. So, for example, a chatcast, an interview, a meditation podcast isn't going to sound the same as Serial. And you can see pages 120 to 121. And then something that hadn't occurred to me, which seems kind of obvious, is the question of cultural differences. So Morris notes that UK podcasts, for example, tend towards really sound-rich stories where the host remains a bit more anonymous, they're a bit more separated from the story, compared to American podcasts, which tend to be chattier and feature the host as a narrator. So at this point, Morris brings in ways that podcasts don't just remix older media, but they allow for novel and creative experimentation. And this really caught my attention because, as I was saying, I had this new recording device to play with. And this shows how this discussion that Morris has shows how podcasts can break away from the popular polished form to do some really interesting things. So he highlights a few podcasts that piqued my interest, and I'll just mention two here. The first is called The World According to Sound. I had to do a little bit of digging to find this because The World According to Sound has grown into a much larger project than the initial podcast. But the podcast was created by Chris Hoff and Sam Harnett, and it originally consists of 60 to 90 second roughly clips of sonic phenomena with no narration. Ones I listen to, they kind of identify what the sound is, and that's it. And you just listen to that sound for 60 to 90 seconds. The creators themselves describe it on their website as a micro podcast, which I think is a really cool term. And as I said, it has since evolved into an 8-channel in-person live audio event. Episodes that I listened to included like the sound of Wi-Fi, the sound of giraffes, and the sound of sand, just sand blowing across a sand dune. Little sounds that we don't hear. So after I mentioned to my partner on a walk on a hot July evening that I wondered what oak trees sound like, the Instagram algorithm, always has a way of doing this, offered me the account of an artist called Chasseur des Sons, linked in the notes, who uses contact microphones to record trees and plants. This is fascinating. I am absolutely fascinated, and I know what I am getting myself for my Christmas present this year. It is going to be some contact microphones. I want to know what things sound like, not just the noise they make, but the noises that we don't hear. I have no intention of becoming a sound artist per se, but I'm really intrigued by the possibility of incorporating sounds that we can't hear through the air into my storytelling. No idea what that's going to look like, but I look forward to playing with it. Anyway, back to Morris. Ultimately, he says, the abundance of podcasts makes it really challenging to identify a particular podcast format. Rather, he suggests that the podcast format is identifiable as being simply a reconfiguration of techniques and inspirations from other media into something new and that's what gives podcasting its distinct aesthetic format. Page 123. So those are the first two levels, formal and format. Final two layers of podcast aesthetics are the socio-technical aesthetics and the social and political aesthetics. The socio-technical aesthetic moves beyond the podcast itself, so in academic terms, beyond the text or the podcast as text, to consider where, when, and through what means the podcast actually reaches the listener. You can look for this discussion on page 124. Here's where we ask how the technology of the podcast shapes the encounter between listener as subject and podcast as object that they engage with. So smartphones give listeners a lot of agency over where and when they consume content. These platforms and devices give listeners a sense of control and mobility. Earphones, especially earbuds, give a sense of physical intimacy. So one of the things I'm going to need to do in my research is define exactly what I mean when I write the word podcast. And it is going to be like nailing Jell-O to a wall, I've decided. But Morris's discussion is going to be really useful for me here. He provides the example of a podcast called What the Deaf. And this is a podcast where the hosts use American Sign Language for their conversation. The audio version features 2 female voices, but when you load the video version, you see that they are actually communicating in ASL, American Sign Language. So this example highlights how technologies intersect with questions of accessibility and who is able or not able to engage with a podcast. Transcripts are also a question here, right? Transcripts are really important for accessibility, but not every podcast has a transcript. And in fact, a lot of podcasts don't have transcripts. My own experience, we didn't do transcripts for Myth Take because it was very labor intensive at the time that podcast came out. There weren't tools to do it for us, and we didn't have funding to pay to have it done. That is a challenge that is very common to indie podcasters, right? Wanting to navigate that accessibility. So as Morris notes here, transcripts are unevenly available. And the question that I ponder here is reading a transcript a different medium and a different experience than listening to a podcast? In other words, can we call reading a transcript listening to a podcast the same way that we now refer to listening to an audiobook as reading? I don't have an answer. Video podcasts also challenge ideas of how we consume and define podcasts. There are some delightfully juicy tidbits to dive into with these questions. I'll be honest here, I am not a video person. I watch a lot of TV, but it's usually background to something else I'm doing. So I'm listening rather than watching. The last thing I really want to do when I'm listening to a podcast is watch two people talking on a screen. However, when Google shuttered their podcast app for Android, they forced all podcasts in kind of that ecosystem through YouTube. And their platform now accounts for roughly 1/3 of podcast listeners in the US, a substantial chunk of audience. But when does a podcast become a video? Or when is a video a podcast? That's another question I'm wrestling with. Because for me, podcasts are an audio experience, and my research is focusing on audio only. Adding in video brings in a whole other set of analytical tools and layers. My current working demarcation between podcasts and videos, currently subject to change, is this. Does the conversation require me to look at a screen to understand what the hosts are talking about? If it does, it's a video podcast or a video. So I've seen some audio podcasts I really like shift towards this video first experience, and I find it a little bit frustrating and annoying, to be perfectly honest. I want to be able to listen to your podcast while I am driving my car, which I cannot do if it's a video. And if it's not an audio first experience, then you'll lose me as a listener. If I need to watch the screen to see and engage with what you're talking about, I can't do other things at the same time. A recent survey shows, though, that I am not alone in not watching podcasts when they are in video form. Nearly half of the folks who consume podcasts on YouTube listen rather than watch. And I'll throw a citation or two into the show notes if you are curious about that. I'm going to pause my rant on this here, but this is a topic I'm going to be returning to repeatedly in the future as I kind of hash out my own thoughts on this. So please feel free to share what your experience or your thoughts on video versus audio podcasting and accessibility. So let's move on now to our fourth and final aesthetic layer, the social and political aesthetics of a podcast. So those first three layers combine to create a sense of how a podcast feels for the listener. Quote Morris on page 128, this fourth layer of analysis taps into a way of thinking about objects and their relationships with the audiences who are experiencing them. So here we get into thinking about podcasting as an intimate medium and an experience that is simultaneously personal and communal. Intimacy refers in part to the parasocial relationship that develops between a listener and a host, the sense that you know the person you're listening to. Techniques to achieve intimacy between host and listener may include serial storytelling, so coming back repeated episodes to build a story, customizable experiences, self-reflexivity, so the host reflecting on how they're podcasting, transparency, and reliance on emotion. So intimacy, Morris says on page 129, can emerge from the relationship between podcasters and listeners, the relationship between listeners and their devices, and from the sound and use of the human voice itself, end quote. Three different aspects there. Podcasting intimacy is a choice. It's constructed through decisions made by the hosts and producers. Remember, editing is never neutral. And again, I like how Morris describes this on page 130. Quote, intimacy emerges as producers make technical choices, as hosts perform authenticity, or as listeners bring podcasts into the private spaces of their lives with devices they have connections to. End quote. Performing authenticity. I think the perception of authenticity is what drives social media influencer culture. I haven't personally researched it, but that's my gut feeling. And I see authenticity as part of what builds trust between a listener and a host. You, as the listener, are trusting that I'm a real person and that what I am saying is reflecting what I actually think and believe and know and understand. So thinking about performance of authenticity, how do I let you know that I'm a real person? But then thinking more about the word performance. If authenticity can be performed, can authenticity be faked? Can it be manipulated? And if it can, what does it even mean to be authentic? I don't have an answer. Further complicating the question, though, Morris highlights this, is how podcasts blur the boundary between private and public spheres. So again, something I am delving into with, Habermas and a bunch of theorists. Podcasts bring private talk into the public sphere. You can listen to what two people or one person is talking about. But then they also bring public conversations into the listener's private spaces. Conversations on public topics, conversations recorded of public talks, for example. So the manipulation of authenticity and the blurring of public and private concepts connects directly to the questions of ethical podcasts I'm working on in my own research. And they tie in to the next article. Relating to the blurring of private and public spaces. I recently, last week or so, read a rather depressing article about how AI-generated podcasts are taking over YouTube. The article is by Jason Koebler in 404 Media, and I'll link to it in the show notes, in case you are a podcaster or you know a podcaster who needs to be further depressed about the deluge of AI slop online. So 404 Media reported that the AI-generated history podcasts on YouTube are drowning out real history podcasts that are created and researched by trained, skilled historians. The AI-generated podcasts repeat things found on the internet, which may or may not be true. They present a flattened, simplified, and misleading, if not outright erroneous, understanding of history. So there's many reasons to be concerned about AI-generated history podcasts, I think. And I'm a historian by training and a classicist. It kind of overlaps a bit. And I think particularly in the current cultural moment, we should be very concerned about how history is being told and retold and manipulated and used and not taught, as well as taught. The AI-generated history podcasts rewrite history. Effectively, they drown out real historical analysis by trained, skilled historians. They flatten the nuances of history, and they reinforce biases and stereotypes that may already be prevalent in historical texts, but that trained historians are working to correct or challenge. So Koebler's article is well worth reading, if you don't mind feeling a little depressed. And he interviews real historian podcasts about the impact this flood of AI slop is having on them as creators and how they're responding to it or not responding to it. But the imagery of this particular line struck me. There is also the somewhat dystopian fact that, because of these videos, there are millions of people being unwittingly lulled to sleep by robots. So I confess that, like Koebler in the article talks about, I do use podcasts to help me fall asleep. I used to listen to the radio. Certain voices discussing topics that are kind of interesting but not too interesting at a low volume that I can hear but not quite hear. It just helps quiet my mind and ease me into sleep, much like a good bedtime story when you're a kid. That liminal space between wakefulness and sleeping, I think of as a vulnerable space where our evolutionary defenses are down and we're vulnerable to predators prowling in the darkness. And we're reliant and trusting on our community members to keep us safe through the night. I've been using the metaphor of campfire stories to talk about my podcast for the past year or so. And this metaphor, I use it because it taps into the orality and the humanness that I feel is at the core of storytelling. I think of the Homeric texts that I studied in my MA. Stories of Odysseus and Achilles were shared orally long before they were written down, long before Darren and I made a podcast about it, and certainly long before first-year university students were assigned to read them. I imagine these stories being shared around a common fire, much as we still share stories around campfires today. The light flickering in the night, keeping the shadowy creatures at bay beyond its glow. The quiet sharing of stories, maybe the hoot of an owl, the call of a loon, murmuring voices, music, laughter that signals safety, peace, trust, connection, belonging. The act of speaking and listening to these stories bonds human relationships, fulfills our human need for connection, community, belonging. Indigenous cultures today around the world continue to use oral storytelling to pass on and create teachings and knowledge of what it means to be part of a group, part of a society, of how we should treat each other, how we should walk a good path with a good mind and a good heart. How to be human. As a creative person, it makes me nervous to see AI foisted on us, whether we want it or not. It's become a magic sauce sloshed across every new device and app. We're told we want it. We're told we need it, that it is our future and it will replace our labor. But seeing AI used to generate the very things that make us human, art and story, that makes me uncomfortable. Inviting robots into our most intimate and vulnerable space, that twilight liminality of falling asleep, to participate in the creation and communication of cultural knowledge, how much of ourselves are we giving up? But it's not all despair. And I don't want to end on that note. I want to believe that humans connecting with humans will win out in the end. So reading Morris's chapter on aesthetics and Kolber's article on AI slop set me up perfectly for the article I read most recently, The Power of Punk Rock Podcasting by Benjamin Lorch. I found this recent article through the Hindenburg blog newsletter. And Hindenburg, for those who are not podcasters, is a company that produces software, audio software for podcasters and journalists. And this article about punk podcasting is refreshing, reaffirming, and reinvigorating. And if you're only going to look at one thing I talk about in this episode, if you're only going to remember one thing I talk about in this episode, please make it this one. Benjamin Lorch, in his post, The Power of Punk Rock Podcasting, delivers a powerful call to reject the over-polished podcast and embrace the dirty, messy, noisy, creative world of podcasting as self-expression. With the rise of AI, he says, we are surrounded by the messaging that AI is better than human, that it will make us obsolete, that we can't learn fast enough or adapt quickly enough to avoid being crushed by it. To quote him directly, AI is developed, built, deployed, and promoted by a very small elite group of digerati. End quote. It serves their needs and profits by convincing us that we are hurtling towards an unavoidable future. It encourages us to stifle our messy human creativity, to produce something that's polished and sane and flat. This is where Lorch calls for the power of punk podcasting to come in. He says, quote, your expression, your voice, your story, your body is the only way out of current dystopic stupor. He goes on, dreams of a better world or a better life begin with your local experience. And when those localities are linked together, they can and will become more powerful than the systems that seek to dominate us. Gives me goosebumps, if I'm honest. So what is punk podcasting? So if you're like me and had kind of a quiet conservative upbringing, you may have missed out on the punk rock scene in your youth. Punk rock emerged in the 1970s in the context of economic stagnation, oil crisis, and the Vietnam War. It was, writes Lorch, marked by an anti-authoritarian, anti-consumerist, anti-establishment attitude and a DIY, do-it-yourself ethos of rebellion and solidarity. Punk rock podcasting rebels against those highly polished, minutely crafted podcasts we love. Lorch argues that what we need now, in the face of all this manicured authority of AI, is fast, dirty, and disruptive shit. Punk's inclusive, don't give a fuck DIY ethos is a tactic of self-expression and resistance that we need. Conforming to the language of AI and the expectations is conforming to a system that we have the right, nay, the obligation to disrupt. Move beyond aesthetics and into action, Lorch urges. Use your voice. Embrace the suck. Crank out something. Be fiercely independent. Be irreverent. And finally, he says, quote, if you want to leave the system, then it's time to start telling your story loud, fast, and often. So, here's to my punk podcasting era. To me, being adventurous with my own sound, to own my own creativity, to celebrate and embrace my own weirdness and uniqueness. I have one question. Will you join me? Thank you so much for listening to Project PhDcast, an audio research journal created, hosted, and produced by me, Alison Innes. You can, as always, find links and articles in the show notes. Please share your thoughts. Get in touch with me through my website. Learn more about this research project and how you can participate by following the link in the show notes. Music is Grand Dark Waltz by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com and is used under Creative Commons license. You can view this podcast with subtitles on YouTube. Transcripts are available for download by request. Project PhDcast is an ongoing project by Alison Innes, PhD student in Interdisciplinary Humanities at Brock University. This research project has been approved by the Research Ethics Board at Brock University, file number 230.